Hello, Grace, and welcome back to Cover to Cover. It is April 14th, and we are going to cover 1 Samuel 17 through 19, and also Psalm 59. First, a quick rundown. At the end of chapter 17, we have the battle of David versus Goliath, and David wins, as we all knew this was going to happen. The Israelite army routs the Philistines, and we have a weird contradiction that takes place. Saul, who loved David in previous chapters, who had David as his armor bearer, who had his tormenting spirit calmed by David's soothing harp music, seems to not know who David is and says, "Who is this young man and what family does he come from?" Proceeding on to chapter 18, David meets Jonathan, and they immediately have a bond one to another. Chapter 18 is kind of like this love chapter. Jonathan loves David. Saul's daughter Michal loves David. The people love David. The Lord loves David. Only Saul doesn't love David. Chapter 19, Saul tries to kill David, and David is saved by Saul's daughter Michal and also by Jonathan. And that leads us to Psalm 59. In this psalm, we kind of get from David's perspective what was happening when Saul was pursuing him and was trying to kill him. And then finally, the chapter ends, Psalm 19, or 1 Samuel 19 ends with David escaping, Saul pursuing him, and then it ends with this really weird story where Saul prophesies, and the last line is Saul also among the prophets? So let us carry on. First, keep in mind that the whole narrative story, the cycle from Exodus all the way through to 2 Kings, is asking a series of what-if questions. Is it possible for the nation of Israel to fulfill the Abrahamic covenant in which all the peoples of the earth are blessed? The history of Israel gives us a series of what-if scenarios, and the book of Judges ends with this claim: there was no king in Israel, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes. It seems to imply that perhaps a king is the answer, for the fulfillment of all of these covenant blessings. And 1 Samuel begins with the explicit request of the people: please give us a king. God chooses Saul, and as we saw in yesterday's lesson, this didn't work out. And so the story of David is now giving us this big what-if scenario. What if we had a king who was totally devoted and obedient to God? What if we had a king who was a man after God's own heart? And recall that the heart is symbolic of a person's whole being. This is what we get to see play out in the David cycle. So let us continue. First off, David defeats Goliath. Recall the book of Judges, where we have this type that's being fulfilled in David. David is this tiny shepherd boy fighting this great warrior, and just as Gideon was outnumbered and fought in insurmountable odds, so was Samson, so is Shamgar. We see this type coming out here again. Is David is going to defeat Goliath, and what does David do? Is he gives God all the credit. David is just the vehicle of deliverance that belongs entirely to God, and he gives it all over to him. Israel routs the Philistines, and we encounter this textual contradiction. In the previous chapter, like I said, David and Saul were kind of like they had this relationship. Saul loved David. David was his armor bearer. Saul had this tormenting spirit, and David would soothe him with his harp playing. So why is it that Saul no longer recognizes David suddenly in this scenario? Scholars usually take one of two tacks on it. One is to try to smooth out this contradiction and explain how, this really isn't a contradiction. Another perspective where I kind of lean is that this is kind of intentionally there. The biblical authors knew exactly what they were doing, and they portrayed this contradiction there on purpose, which leads us to the question is, what is that purpose? What's going on? And part of what's happening is it's portraying David as existing in what we would call a liminal space. David is in some sense like the tabernacle itself. The heavenly and cosmic realm is kind of present in David's own activity, and his actions are directed and moved by God. All the while, he's still present in this material realm. So when Saul looks at David and he sees the power of God on David, it is something that Saul is unable to recognize. And so we have this contradiction kind of there intentionally to kind of give us an idea of what David really embodies. In chapter 18, we see this idea of liminal space play out a little bit more. I call this the love chapter because everybody loves David except for Saul. It begins with the friendship of Jonathan and David. And note that Jonathan and David are immediately bound one to another. Jonathan gives David his robe and his weapons, and this signifies not only does Jonathan trust David with his own life, but there's also kind of an idea of Jonathan stating that David deserves the kingship, that David is a better ruler, is more fit to have this authority than even Jonathan is. The people love David, and the women sing songs of praise. Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands. Saul hears this, and he gets very angry. He's not happy. Saul becomes so jealous that someone else gets greater praise than him, and he also sees the writing on the wall, and he says, only the kingship is not yet his. And so Saul seems to idea. So right now we have Jonathan seem to be acknowledging David's ability to lead, and now Saul is also acknowledging too, but they're also interpreting this ability, understanding it in very different ways. The Lord is with David, and this is a refrain throughout the chapter. Saul's jealousy and hatred of David correlates, first of all, to David's praise, but more importantly, there's this recurring signal throughout the text that when Saul sees that the Lord is with David, he fears David. And so if David is standing in this liminal space where heaven and earth comes together, it's really positioning Saul as outside of that space, as he's fully in the world, and when he sees God, he is struck with nothing other than fear. And so it's really confirming the presence of God in David's life. Finally, Saul's daughter Michal also loves David. Both Jonathan and Michal in chapter 19 work to save David's life from Saul. Jonathan advocates on behalf of David, says, hey, please don't kill my friend. And Saul goes ahead and throws a spear and tries to kill him anyways. And then we get this like spy novel scenario where Michal, Saul's daughter, hides David, gets a dummy, sticks it in the bed, covers it with, fake hair and everything, and said, hey, he's sick. And through this, we were able to buy some time for David to escape. And that leads us to Psalm 59, where we have this wonderful opportunity to look at this whole scenario, all these narrative events, and look at them from the perspective of David. And two things kind of stick out. The first is that God is everywhere. Deliverance comes from God. God is the one who punishes his enemies. God alone saves. Second, and this is kind of seems like a contradiction, but in a sense, God is nowhere. We don't see any manna. We don't see the parting of the Red Sea. We don't see fire from heaven. There is a complete absence of the miraculous in this narrative. But again, in Psalm 59, David sees and encounters the miraculous in every aspect of life. Finally, our section ends with the question, is Saul among the prophets? Saul attempts to kill David. He sends a squads plural of hitmen to go after him. And then he personally seeks out David to go kill him. And then something interesting happens. The same Spirit of God that empowered Saul at the start of his ministry now incapacitates him. Saul lies naked on the ground, and the relinquishing of his royal robes signifies the relinquishing of his anointed position as king. And thank you for joining us for Cover to Cover.